It's Wednesday, December 14th, 2022, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the studio in the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are my colleagues Kathy Kiley and Ernest Perry. On our program this week, the sudden and mysterious death of 3 journalists covering the World Cup in Qatar, including American Grant Wahl. The first work stoppage at the New York Times in more than 4 decades. We'll talk about why Guild members walked out for 24 hours last Thursday. And we're going to talk again about the latest at Twitter. Now, another move from Elon Musk that has many, including the Committee to Protect Journalists, worried. There's a lot more that hopefully we'll get to as well before our half hour is up today. But we're going to start with the release of WNBA star Brittany Griner from a Russian penal colony in a prisoner swap. Griner, as you probably know, was serving 9 years for bringing medicinal CBD oil into that country, not aware that it was illegal. It was no secret that there were negotiations underway for her release and that it was likely going to be in exchange for the release of Victor Bout. Boot. But what no one was expecting was that it was going to happen last Thursday morning, except CBS News.
I just want to make this point here to you because I think it's important disclosure to our viewers. CBS first learned that this swap was going to happen last Thursday, and CBS News agreed that the Griner for Bout swap, which we knew was underway, that we would not report on the details of it. This was at the request of the White House, which asked us not to make it public because officials expressed grave concern about the fragility of the emerging deal and feared it would impede the safety, perhaps even put those Americans at risk. And so we are bringing this news to you first this morning, Gail, and it is certainly good news for the Griner family.
It is so exciting, and of course we kept our word on that.
Of course.
We've known about it for some time. Just to see it happen and come about, Margaret, I can't tell you how excited everybody is that was pulling for Brittany Griner. This is such great news. Thank you, Margaret.
So CBS first got a tip about this happening back on December 1st, that Griner would be going free, corroborated it with 5 different sources by the next day, but had agreed to that White House request to sit on the story. Talk about why they made that arrangement.
Well, this is the kind of thing that news organizations, responsible news organizations, do frequently. And it's always controversial because our mandate is to give the public information, but there are times when that information might put people in danger. And so it's something we talk about in our classes here, the kind of ethical dilemmas that we're confronted with in situations like this. But I thought CBS did a really great job of being transparent about what they had not done and then did, and also in explaining why, because there really was a danger that the deal could come unglued, and they didn't want that to happen. So I think this is a demonstration. You know, it's something we talk about a lot with solutions journalism, that we are part of the community, the world we live in, and of course we root for people to be safe, and that's what CBS was doing here, and they were trying to do their part in keeping Brittany Griner safe.
Yeah, I mean, I think they handled it very well, and they explained why they did what they did, which I think more journalism organizations need to do when they find themselves not only in situations like this, but in other situations, be more transparent about how it is you went about getting that information and how you, in the thought process in disseminating that information. So I think they did a very good job in this instance.
How common is it for the White House or a government agency at a different level to make a request like this and for journalists to also stand by it?
Well, I think it's not common, but I think it certainly happens. And certainly, I think post 9/11, you saw a lot more of this, where the government was citing national security. Sometimes news organizations comply, and sometimes they don't. And an example, I think, where organizations didn't comply was the first WikiLeaks release. And the New York Times had a very good, again, very transparent explanation. They put something up for their readers saying, this is why we felt this information was within the purview of the public's right to know. So I think these are decisions that can go either way. But I think I agree with what Ernest said, that it's really important for news organizations to be transparent. Because I think it's a mark of credibility. When you say, these are the decisions we made, you could agree with us, you could disagree with us, but this is what we did and this is why we did it. So it's something that shows you're not just shooting from the hip, you're being responsible in your actions and your thinking.
Yeah, I mean, it actually happens at the local level as well. I mean, in particular when you're covering law enforcement, or you're covering the judicial system, when the police are asking you, hey, we would like, we're going to give you some information, but we know that you have more. We're going to ask you not to put that out there because it could put someone's life in danger, because there could be a suspect or someone who's still at large who could do more damage. And so, and in those instances, I don't know if there's enough transparency on the part of local news organizations to do that. And I'm thinking that maybe they need to be doing more of that as a way to show the public that, hey, we did have more information about the suspect, but to put that information out there would have put someone in danger. And that's something that doesn't happen very much at the local level.
I think of an example of that builds exactly on what you're talking about. Back when I was producing, I worked with an anchor who pointed out, rightfully so, because she would take out of every single one of our scripts if we indicated where somebody who had been a victim of a crime indicated what hospital they were taken to. And she would say to me over and over again, and she was right, and I think I try now to instill this too, the person was taken to the hospital in critical condition or taken to the hospital with life-threatening injuries. We don't need to tell people what hospital, because we don't need somebody to go and finish off the job. Right.
That could be an instance, or the fact that the person's still at large and that they may be at home or they may be with a family member, that sort of thing. Some information doesn't need to be out there. You can still tell the story and give enough information to the public without putting others in danger.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the kind of professional news judgment you want people to exercise. Say, what does the public really need to know to understand this story, and what is extraneous information that could create problems, create legal problems, create, even in some cases, as Amy pointed out, put somebody in danger.
Yeah, I mean, with the Griner case, I mean, what I find interesting is second, third day stories where now you have this analysis coming in as to, okay, should the government have done more to get Whelan out? And what steps did they take to do that? And so now you've got this counter going back and forth. And what I find interesting is that at least the mainstream media, they haven't engaged in a lot of that. Should they have done this? Should they have not done this? But you're seeing a lot of it within the cable news structure and within the partisan media going back and forth about what could and should have been done, or if anything should have been done for that matter.
Well, and it's clear that there are still negotiations going on, and so that may be why you're seeing really top-flight news organizations keeping a more quiet approach.
So when that story broke, the New York Times covered it, and it was the paper's centerpiece online and in print. Coverage came out of the Washington bureau, headed up by Peter Baker and Michael Shear, two reporters who said that they would be at work on Thursday. Going to work is only notable when the others around you don't. And more than 1,100 members of the New York Times union did not go to work on Thursday, carrying out a 24-hour work stoppage. Now, this was a powerful move among union members because salary negotiations and benefit negotiations, they're still going on. At the same time, this was not without its levels of controversy.
Yeah, well, it's powerful in one sense as an act of theater, but the fact is that writers' unions have very little clout in newspapers. If you can't get the team, it used to be the Teamsters, because the Teamsters delivered the papers. Now that news is delivered electronically, it's very, very difficult for writers to get any kind of leverage in contract negotiations because people can just fill the news hole with wire copy or whatever. But I do think that the writers were trying to make a point because they have not had a contract for a long time. On the other side, I think New York Times management feels like, hey, we haven't had the layoffs that many news organizations have had. So, this is another sign of the economic straits that the news industry is in.
And I mean, the Guild is not as strong as it used to be. You're right. When the Guild went on strike, you could usually have the distribution, which was handled by the Teamsters. They would
and we're
go
talking
on
about
strike.
the Newspaper Guild, which is the writers' union.
Which is the writers' union. And this is not unusual in the business. And the New York Times, at least the management side, is right to a certain extent that they have not done the layoffs that you've seen at the Washington Post and at other places. But they also have, in many ways, not kept up with raises and benefits and that sort of thing. So it's going to be interesting to see how long this sort of plays out, and if the New York Times itself may not have to go to layoffs in order to deal with their own money issues.
Yeah.
There's a piece on our Links blog that was written by Max Tawney from Semaphore, and he was the one who wrote very specifically about the divide within the New York Times Guild and the idea that Baker and Scheer would be working on Thursday. And their reason and what they said is that there is a bit of a concern generationally among members of the Guild that what is being asked for in the negotiation isn't just about salary and benefits, but it's a stronger push towards social justice and creating, I don't know if I want to use the word accommodations, but recognizing the need and establishing norms around social justice and lifestyle issues as well. And reading that, I can't shake the idea that perhaps the next big reckoning after race and after gender is going to be that generational divide, that boomers and Gen Xers, we kind of want to say, suck it up, buttercup, go to work. This is what we do. And millennials and Gen Z, that they're really looking for different types of benefit packages, different types of expectations of what a workplace should look and feel like.
Well, I mean, I think that you're starting to see that in a lot of industries. This is part of the, I guess, what some would call the new union movement, which is not just centered around salaries. It's also around benefits, but it's also around what is my work life going to look like, and is there a work-life balance, and what does that mean, and can that be codified into agreements and relationships with employers? Because a lot of this is an outgrowth of COVID, where people, I mean, it was even prior to COVID, but they really began to see that, wait a minute, we can be laid off or find ourselves in situations that are not, that won't work for us in a moment during a crisis. And now they're looking for stability. That's the one thing you hear over and over again, is we want stability and we want some assurances. And so that's what's happening. And like I said, I mean, the media economy is dealing with it now, but all the industries, I mean, from Starbucks to the automotive industry to grocery stores,
and
are dealing
what
with it.
Collective bargaining is always all about. But bottom line is, it still comes down to the bottom line.
Yeah,
because
exactly,
in order to accommodate,
That's why they call it the bottom line.
Yeah, in order to accommodate some of the requests that you're talking about, you need to hire more people.
Right.
And people And human resources are expensive.
That's right. Labor is your biggest expense.
People require health insurance. They're so inconvenient. They're not like bots.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, as much as I try to go a week without making hay over something happening at Twitter, Elon Musk goes and does something new that we just cannot ignore. This week, it was the return of the Twitter Blue subscription and the dissolution of the Trust and Safety Council. This advisory group was made up of some 100 human and civil rights groups. It was convened in 2016 to address hate speech, child exploitation, suicide, and other self-harm. Come on, trust? Protections around communications about child exploitation or self-harm? Who needs that?
Well, I mean, again, I think I've said this.
I know.
Talked
That's why I'm
about
saying
Twitter for the last couple of weeks. Elon Musk said he was going to do this.
Well, I was going to say rewind to 2016 when you and Mike McKean and I had this pact we weren't going to talk about Donald Trump unless he made news.
Right.
We may need to go back there with Elon Musk.
We may have to, but again, he said he was going to do this.
Well, what he actually said, though, was that he was not going to bring back any of the previously banned people. I'm thinking again of Donald Trump, until he had established his own mechanism to fight some of these issues, some of these speech issues, some of these self-harm issues.
But he didn't say what that mechanism
that.
was going to be. And what we're finding out is the mechanism is him. So,
Fair.
I mean, again, I'm why are we surprised?
Elon Musk is just going to keep doing things to make you need to talk about him, Amy. He's an exhibitionist.
Well, yeah, fair enough. But that does kind of also lead to this question, too, right? We were talking, 3 weeks ago about the emergence of other platforms, of Post News, of Mastodon, and this idea of people running and doing, and NPR issuing some kind of emergency guidelines to member stations such as KBIA, some things that we've adopted here on this program. But if I open my TweetDeck, my Twitter feed, I still see journalists and news organizations operating as though nothing's actually going on. There are no real visible changes.
We're addicted. Just like everybody else online. It's an addictive thing. And Twitter has been the platform of choice for journalists. I agree with you. I think people keep going back to it. I think the idea of, it's really kind of like what we've talked so much about with television. If you do not have a single platform that quote unquote everybody is using, but in this case it would be everybody in our business, you're going to what we're seeing in streaming. Which channel are you going to choose? And that really dilutes the power of the platform because it was a place you could go and you could follow colleagues, you could see what was going on. But if people leave it, which I have taken a pause, but it then becomes, where do I go now? And I think a lot of journalists haven't figured that out. What we really don't appreciate is the platforms we have, which are far more powerful than Twitter.
And by that, do you mean our actual owned platforms?
Exactly.
Our own channels.
Exactly. But it doesn't give you kind of the neural feedback that a like or a retweet does.
There's a legit dopamine.
Absolutely, 100%
infusion
and
there.
When I say addictive, it's addictive. I think there are a lot of people who think, I really should give that up. It's kind of like the cigarettes of our generation, but it's not really good for me. But
I mean, it's sort of that
I need another
affirmation.
hit.
If you put a story out there and you've gotten all these likes, then you want to keep going back to see, okay, how's it doing now? How's it trending? That's, I think, what keeps drawing journalists back in to see, how many, not who's liking me, but how many I have.
Yeah. And the funny thing, it's no different than anybody else online. But the funny thing with journalists is we should certainly know better. And we have these huge megaphones in the form of microphones and antennas and printing presses. But because you don't get the immediate feedback from that you would on a social network, we somehow get more satisfaction from that.
Right.
Okay, so both the soccer and journalism worlds are mourning the death of prominent writer Grant Wahl. He was a former Sports Illustrated writer who moved to Substack, and he died on Friday. He collapsed while at the quarterfinal match between Argentina and the Netherlands at the start of extra time. Reporters on site called for help and said that medics arrived immediately to treat him. Only it's not just Grant Wahl. There are now a total of 3 journalists who were in Qatar covering the tournament, and the circumstances of their deaths aren't totally unsimilar. Now, Wahl had tweeted earlier in the week he'd had some health issues, that he had been seeing doctors for breathing problems. It was diagnosed as bronchitis after a negative COVID test. And he blamed travel, sleep deprivation, working too hard, and high stress. Today, the autopsy results were made public that there was an aneurysm and an aortic embolism that had happened there. But he's not alone.
Yeah, there are 2 other journalists, one of them a British journalist named Roger Pierce, who was very well known with insiders. He wasn't an on-the-air person, but he was the technical director for ITV Sports. He died in late November while he was at the World Cup. It was his 8th World Cup, so that hit a lot of journalists hard because he was well known to them. And then I think just yesterday or a day after Wall's death, Khalid al-Mislami, who is a photojournalist for a Qatari television station named Al-Qas, died. And we really don't know too much, but I think you're right, Amy, the suddenness of their deaths. And these were all people who were relatively on the young side. I think the oldest was Pierce, and he was 65. So kind of young to be falling down dead in the middle of an assignment. It's a very strange situation.
Yeah, and it is strange, especially for these world events. I mean, you know, we talk about the Olympics that come around every 4 years, the World Cup, those types of things. To have this many journalists who basically die at these events. I mean, you just don't hear about this, and it is strange that we were getting all this information as we get toward the end of the World Cup. I mean, we have one more semifinal game left, and then we go to the finals, and now this is happening. I wonder if it's just the stress of that the journalists themselves are under in covering this. I mean, because it's not just what they have to do when they get on site; it's everything they have to do to prepare to be on site. So it may be
And the World Cup is unusual among sports events, except maybe the Olympics is equally a marathon,
right? Yes,
for journalists. But it is day after day after day. It's not just like the Super Bowl, one and done. It's a lot of events to cover. But there's just something, and you also wonder. I mean, journalists get a lot of attention because we're journalists, and so if something happens to us, our colleagues write about it or do air broadcasts about it. But you wonder if there are other people who are getting sick. So it is a very strange situation. I think it definitely warrants more reporting.
It would be interesting to see how the World Cup is looked at once the games are over. There's been reporting done in terms of how Qatar was able to get the World Cup, what happened in the construction of all the facilities and the migrant workers and their plight, some of the bribery that was going on both in FIFA and outside of that. It's going to be interesting to see what happens after that, because the Qataris were really hoping that they would get a lot of publicity, a lot of positive publicity.
I was going to say they got publicity. It just wasn't the publicity they wanted.
Right,
exactly.
right. And will that continue is going to be interesting to see.
Well, so these 3 journalists who died in connection to their work, they are among close to 70 who have died this year worldwide. And because this is our last program of 2022, I wanted to ask the 2 of you to take a look back and a look ahead at what the year has brought and see what you see coming in 2023. So, Kathy, let's start with you. Some of the biggest stories affecting journalism in this year for you.
Well, I think some of them we've touched on. I guess we touch on them all the time. I mean, obviously, the continued animosity towards the press globally. I mean, this is a world war for free speech, and it's going to take a while to win, but we have to win it. And but I think it's complicated by the fact that even in a rich country like ours, and one that has prided itself on holding up the press, constitutionally protecting it, there are big threats to the press, and the biggest one is economic. The continued layoffs that we've talked about, the hollowing out of newsrooms, doesn't help the public, and it doesn't help build trust. The other story I think that is a big one is really Twitter, and what I'll be watching for, because it is, to me, it is kind of like the synecdoche for all social media. Is this going to be a turning point either in how we engage with social media or how our governments and public policy officials engage with social media? And that, I think, will say a lot about how media in general, the state of media health going into 2023.
Sort of to piggyback off of that, I would say one of the biggest concerns I see is what's going to happen with the local news. I was reading some stories over the weekend about the midterm elections that just ended, but not just the national midterm elections, but what was happening locally in the state houses, what was happening in the school boards, what was happening on the city council, and the fact that you had in many places these sort of national, you could say they're PACs or whatever, who have sort of pushed themselves into local elections, in particular school boards that have agendas that are now sort of, a lot of it is around LGBTQ issues, around critical race theory, that sort of thing. And the fact that a lot of these stories are now being talked about, but why weren't they talked about significantly, in a way that you talk about nationally before the election. And I think that's what's happening in media, is that from an economic standpoint, we don't have enough reporters on the ground. We don't have enough reporters in local news, be it local television, be it newspapers, be it startups or whatever, who are dealing with these issues. And then we find out after the fact that, hey, school boards have been taken over by people who have an agenda that doesn't necessarily fit with the entire community, but a small segment of the community. And so I think that we're going to see more and more of that as we see the economic ramifications of the recession and other things on the journalism industry.
Is that a challenge to our journalists here in our local market too?
It's a challenge to.
No, I'm saying, are you issuing a challenge?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Is that Dr. Perry saying this is what we need to be looking at here too?
These are the things that we really need to be looking at.
And it's a challenge to our policymakers, because the reason you have fewer boots on the ground is that you have less ad revenue. The reason you have less ad revenue is that the digital economy and the ability to micro-target has taken that money away. So what do we do? That's why I say the decisions that we make about social media and the questions we answer are going to really set a course for us.
And the legal safeguards have been taken away in terms of allowing monopolies to develop, which does away with any ability to be able to have more competition.
Okay.
100%.
Well, we are just about out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. Read more about each of the topics we talked about today on our links blog. You can find that under both the programs and podcast tabs at kbia.org. We're also available wherever you get your podcast downloads, including iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher. And you can follow us on most popular social media platforms. We're pretty easy to find there. These are all great ways to watch and listen to the program again, leave comments, questions, see what we'll be talking about next time. Thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing the show, Kyle Felling for handling the audio, and Tim Pilcher for our theme music. We'll see you again January 18th.